A lone farmer was writing a goodbye letter when a strange woman asked, "Are you the special?" Then, what happens next will shock you. Before we continue this story, let us know where you are watching from, if you enjoy stories like this, and subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another special story for you. The ink was still wet on the goodbye letter when 3 loud knocks broke the quiet of Tobias Crane's little house. He froze, his rough hand stuck over the last words he thought no one would ever read. For 2 years, no one had come to his far-off home. Now, with death being his only planned guest, someone was at his door. Tobias pushed away from the wooden table, his chair scratching against the rough floor. Through the dirty window, the sun was setting over the Colorado territory, making the empty land orange and red. He'd picked this moment carefully. Sunset felt right for an ending, but those knocks had ripped through his careful plans like a bullet through paper. He walked to the door as carefully as he used to track hurt animals. His rough fingers wrapped around the cold metal handle, and he opened it just enough to peek. Outside, what he saw made him gasp. A woman stood there, but just barely. Her face was covered in fresh bruises, purple and black marks that showed she'd been hurt badly. Her dress, which was once blue, was torn at the shoulder, and had what looked like blood on it. Her dark hair hung in messy strands around her face, and her green eyes showed a mix of fear and toughness that reminded him of an animal stuck in a corner. She looked up at him with those fierce green eyes and spoke in a shaky but strong voice. "Are you the one they call the Phantom of Pine Ridge?" Tobias felt his stomach drop. That name, he hadn't heard it spoken in over 2 years. It belonged to a different man, a different life, a past he'd buried as deep as the bodies he'd left behind. He'd thought that name had died with his old life, but it seemed some stories just wouldn't stay buried. The woman swayed a little, and he saw she was favoring her left leg. Blood had soaked through a tear in her dress just above her knee. She'd been running, probably for miles, through land that could kill a person in many ways. Yet here she was, looking for a ghost. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice rough from not talking much. But even as the words came out, he could see in her eyes that she didn't believe him. Something about his face, how he stood, or maybe just how he carried himself, gave him away. She took a step closer, and he could smell her fear, mixed with sweat, blood, and something else, gunpowder. "Please," she whispered, and the word carried the heavy feeling of someone who had no other choices left. "They're coming for me, and if you really are who I think you are, you're the only one who can help me." Tobias glanced past her into the growing darkness. The wind didn't carry the sound of horses coming, but that didn't mean much. He'd learned a long time ago that the most dangerous hunters were the ones you couldn't hear coming. His hand automatically went to where his gun belt used to be, finding only empty air. He'd buried his weapons with his old life, but now he wondered if some things should never be left behind. But the real question burning in his mind wasn't about who was chasing her, or what they wanted. It was simpler and more scary. How had she found him? He'd hidden his tracks better than anyone alive, had become a ghost in every way. Yet this hurt woman had walked straight to his door and said a name that should have died with the man who'd earned it. The woman's legs gave out, and she fell against his doorframe, her breathing quick and shallow. Blood was spreading faster through the tear in her dress, and her skin looked pale and waxy, a look he knew too well. She was running on nothing but pure stubbornness now, and even that was fading fast. Against everything in his head, screaming at him, Tobias caught the woman before she could hit the ground. The moment his hands touched her arms, he felt her body tremble, part pain, part relief, part terror that he might turn her away. Her skin was cold, even though the evening was warm, and he could feel her pulse racing against his palm like a trapped bird. He should have stepped back, closed the door, and let whatever was hunting her find its prey. That would have been the smart choice, the safe choice. Instead, he found himself half carrying her inside, his forgotten goodbye letter still on the table behind them. The funny part wasn't lost on him. He'd been ready to end his life tonight, and now he was risking it for a complete stranger. "What's your name?" he asked, as he carefully lowered her onto the only chair in his simple cabin. She winced as her hurt leg took weight, and he noticed her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from losing blood. "Celeste," she whispered, then immediately added, "Celeste Morrison." The short pause between her first and last name was so quick, most people wouldn't have noticed it. But Tobias had spent years listening for lies. Either Morrison wasn't her real name, or she was married to someone she was afraid to say. He knelt beside her injured leg, looking at the wound through the torn fabric. It was deep, but clean. A knife cut, not a bullet. Someone had gotten close enough to hurt her on purpose, very personally. This wasn't just random violence or a robbery gone wrong. This was personal. Who did this to you? He asked, his voice harder than he meant it to be. Celeste's eyes darted to the window, then back to him. Men who think they own me, she said simply. Men who don't like being told no. Tobias stood and moved to his small pile of medical things, a bottle of whiskey, some clean rags, and a needle and thread he'd used more times than he wanted to remember. As he gathered what he needed, he could feel her watching him, studying his moves. She was taking note of everything about him, just as he was doing with her. The Phantom of Pine Ridge, she said quietly. They say he was the fastest gun in 3 lands. They say he killed 12 men in a single day and walked away without a scratch. They say he could track a whisper across stone and disappear like smoke when he wanted to. Tobias's hands stopped on the whiskey bottle. Those weren't just stories, they were memories. Very specific memories that only a few people had seen, and most of those people were dead. They say a lot of things, he replied, not turning around. Most of it nonsense. They also say he disappeared after the awful event at Broken Creek. Just vanished like he never existed at all. Her voice was getting stronger, more focused, as if talking was helping her fight off the shock. But I think he didn't disappear. I think he's been hiding, waiting for something worth fighting for again. Tobias turned back to her, whiskey and rags in hand. And you think you're worth fighting for? Celeste met his eyes without backing down. I think I'm the only chance you have of dying for something other than just being lonely and full of sadness. The words hit him hard, like a punch. She'd somehow seen right through to the heart of who he'd become. A man so empty from guilt and being alone that he'd been ready to end it all instead of facing another sunrise. But how could she know that? How could a stranger read him so clearly, when he'd spent 2 years being completely invisible? Before he could ask, the sound of horses' hooves far away reached his ears. Celeste's whole body went stiff, her eyes wide with fear she couldn't quite hide. They found me, she breathed. Tobias moved to the window and looked out into the growing darkness. He counted at least 4 riders coming from the east, moving fast but not carelessly. These weren't just common bad guys or drifters. They rode, with purpose and discipline, like soldiers even on horseback. How many? Celeste asked, her voice barely a whisper. For that I can see, he replied. Could be more hiding back. She tried to stand, gasping as her wounded leg hurt. I have to run. I have to. You won't make it. 50 yards, Tobias said plainly. Not with that leg. Not against riders. The hoofbeats were getting closer, and now he could hear voices calling. Out in the darkness, they weren't even trying to be quiet anymore. They knew they had their prey trapped. But what really scared Tobias was the feeling that part of him was glad they were coming. For the first time in 2 years, he felt something other than the heavy weight of his own guilt. He felt a reason to be. Tobias moved with the smooth quickness of a man who'd spent years living on the edge, between life and death. He grabbed Celeste under her arms and half-carried her toward the back of the cabin, away from the main window. She bit back a cry of pain as her wounded leg dragged across the rough wooden floor, but she didn't complain or slow him down. There's a root cellar, he whispered, pulling up a hidden trapdoor near his bed. Get down there and don't make a sound, no matter what you hear. Celeste grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. What are you going to do? What I should have done 2 years ago, he replied, and for the first time since she'd arrived, his voice had the cold sharpness that had once made grown men step aside. I'm going to stop running. The hoofbeats were close enough now that he could tell individual horses apart. For riders, just as he'd counted, but they'd spread out as they came closer, a classic pincer move, meant to block escape routes. These men knew what they were doing, which meant they were either military trained or had fought dangerous people before. Celeste disappeared into the cellar, and Tobias put the trapdoor back just as boots hit the ground outside. He could hear low voices talking, someone giving orders in short, bossy tones. They weren't rushing in blindly. They were planning their approach, like soldiers taking a strong pea. Celeste disappeared into the cellar, and Tobias put the trapdoor back just as boots hit the ground outside. He could hear low voices talking, someone giving orders in short, bossy tones. They weren't rushing in blindly. They were planning their approach like soldiers taking a strong position. Tobias looked around his simple cabin with new eyes. 2 years of purposely letting it go to ruin had made it the perfect place for a trick. Dust covered most surfaces. Cobwebs hung in the corners, and the whole place felt abandoned, like a man who'd already given up on life, which, until an hour ago, had been exactly true. He moved to his bedroom and knelt beside the bed, running his fingers along the floorboards until he found the right one. It came up easily, showing a carefully wrapped bundle he'd thought he'd never touch again. His gun belt, cleaned and oiled, even after 2 years of not being used, along with the matching Colt .45s that had made the Phantom of Pine Ridge a legend. The weight of the guns in his hands brought back memories he'd tried to bury. The good feeling of shooting perfectly. The split-second timing that meant the difference between doing what was right and a terrible killing. The heavy responsibility that came with being faster than anyone else alive. He'd promised himself he'd never wear these guns again. But some promises weren't meant to be kept. A sharp knock echoed through the cabin. Polite, almost proper. "Anyone home?" called a voice with the smooth confidence of a man used to being obeyed. "We're looking for someone, and we'd appreciate your help." Tobias strapped on his gun belt with practiced skill, feeling the familiar weight settle against his hips. The leather was still soft, the holsters placed exactly where his body remembered them being. His hands had found their natural spot near the grips before he'd even thought about it. "Coming," he called back, purposely making his voice sound older, more tired than it was. He slouched his shoulders and shuffled toward the door, changing himself into exactly what these men would expect to find. A broken-down old man who wasn't a threat to anyone. But beneath that carefully put-together act, the Phantom of Pine Ridge was waking up from a 2-year sleep. And he was angry. The door opened to show 4 men standing in a half-circle around his porch. The leader stood right in front, tall, despite the trail dust, with the kind of clean-shaven face that suggested money and power. The other 3 stayed back a little, hands resting casually near their weapons, eyes constantly looking for danger. "Evening," the leader said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Name's Colonel Marcus Whitfield. We're tracking a dangerous runaway who may have passed through this area. Young woman, dark hair, probably hurt. You seen anyone like that?" Tobias let his eyes wander over the 4 men with the unfocused look of someone who rarely saw other people. But behind his carefully faked confusion, he was taking note of everything. The way Whitfield's hand rested on his sword. The nervous energy of the man to his left. The fresh scratches on the face of the rider to his right. These weren't just any men. They were hunters, and Celeste had drawn blood before she'd escaped. "Don't get many visitors out here," Tobias said, letting his voice crack slightly. "Been just me and the coyotes for, must be going on 3 years now." He scratched his beard and squinted at them, as if talking was hard work. "You say you're looking for someone." Colonel Whitfield's smile tightened, almost impossible to notice. "A woman. She's unwell, needs medical attention. Her family is very worried about her." The lie came out smoothly, but Tobias caught the slight emphasis on family. A word that carried importance and hinted at bad things for anyone who got in the way. "Dangerous?" Tobias asked, playing up his confusion. "Doesn't look dangerous to me, living alone out here, with nothing but a few chickens, and some sorry excuse for a garden." One of the other men, the nervous one, shifted his weight and spoke up. "She's got a knife. Old man. Cut up Sergeant Morrison here, pretty good before she ran." He pointed to the scratched man, and suddenly, pieces started to click into place in Tobias's mind. Morrison. Celeste had called herself Celeste Morrison. And now here was a man with that same name, with fresh scratches on his face. Not a random group of hunters at all. This was personal. Family trouble turned violent. The worst kind of hunt because it never ended until someone was dead. "Well now," Tobias said, letting his voice carry the slow rhythm of a man whose thoughts moved like thick syrup. "Can't say I've seen hide nor hair of any woman. Like I said, don't get visitors. Gets mighty lonely. But I suppose that's what I chose when I mind if we take a look around." Whitfield interrupted, his patience clearly running out. "Just to be thorough, I'm sure you understand." The words sounded like a request, but the tone made it clear that saying no wasn't an option. Whitfield was already taking a step toward the door, his men moving to stand on either side of him. They'd done this before. Trapped someone in their own home, used politeness as a weapon to get close before striking. Tobias stepped aside with fake reluctance. "Well, I suppose, though there ain't much to see. Place is barely fit for one person, let alone hiding someone." As Whitfield brushed past him into the cabin, Tobias caught the scent of expensive tobacco and something else. Blood. Faint, but definitely there. Fresh blood that wasn't from any scratches on Sergeant Morrison's face. The colonel's eyes swept the inside of the cabin with a soldier's carefulness, taking in the few furnishings, the layers of dust, the general feeling of being abandoned. But when his gaze fell on the table, his face changed. There, still sitting in plain sight, was Tobias's goodbye letter. Ink still wet, pen lying beside it. Looks like we interrupted something important, Whitfield said, moving toward the table. His voice had changed, less like a hunter, almost gentle. Writing letters at this hour. Tobias felt his heart beating hard against his ribs, but he forced himself to keep his shuffling, defeated posture. Oh, that. Just some old thoughts that needed getting out. Nothing important. Whitfield picked up the letter, his eyes quickly reading the first lines. Whatever he read made him pause, then look at Tobias with something that might have been sympathy. I see. Well, a man's personal letters are his own business. But as he set the letter back down, his hand brushed against the ink, and Tobias saw him realize that it was still wet, fresh, very recent. The colonel's eyes sharpened, and when he looked up again, there was a calculating look instead of sympathy. Sergeant Morrison, Whitfield called, without taking his eyes off Tobias. Check the back room thoroughly. The scratched man moved toward the bedroom, and Tobias felt time slowing down, the way it always had in the moments before violence. Morrison was heading straight for the bedroom, where the loose floorboard would show his hidden weapons in seconds. They'd know exactly who they were dealing with. But more importantly, Morrison would be close enough to the hidden trapdoor that he might hear Celeste breathing, or notice the slight draft coming from the hidden cellar. Everything was about to fall apart, and Tobias had to make a choice. Keep pretending, and hope they missed her. Or stop pretending, and become the Phantom again. The decision was made for him when Morrison's boot caught the edge of the trapdoor, and it shifted slightly with a soft creak that seemed to echo through the cabin like a gunshot. The creak of the shifting trapdoor seemed to hang in the air like the sound of a death sentence. Tobias watched Morrison's eyes narrow as he knelt down, running his fingers along the edge of the wooden planks. In 3 seconds, maybe 4, he'd figure out what he was looking at. And then Celeste would be dead, followed quickly by Tobias himself. Time slowed to that clear moment, before violence, that Tobias remembered so well. He could see Morrison's hand moving toward the edge of the trapdoor. Could hear Whitfield behind him, asking something about the back room. Could feel the weight of his hidden Colts against his hips. Every muscle in his body coiled like a spring, waiting for the moment when the act would break and the killing would begin. But then Morrison straightened up, shaking his head. Nothing back here, Colonel. Just a bed and some old clothes. The trapdoor had settled back into place so perfectly that Morrison had thought the small sound was just the normal creaks of an old house. The scratches on his face were apparently making him less focused than he'd realized. Tobias felt a drop of sweat roll down his back, but he kept his slouched posture and empty look. Like I told you fellas, ain't nothing here but me and my sad thoughts. Whitfield nodded, but his eyes stayed sharp and calculating. Of course, but you understand, we have to be thorough. This woman is valuable to certain people. There's a big reward for her safe return. The word valuable hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Not dangerous, not wanted for crimes, valuable. Celeste wasn't a criminal they were tracking. She was property they meant to get back. The difference made Tobias's blood run cold. Because he knew exactly what kind of men treated women like property, to be bought and sold. Big, you say? Tobias let his voice carry the eager tone of someone who'd been alone too long and was desperate for human contact. How big are we talking about? Whitfield's smile returned, like a predator, and confident. Enough to make a man comfortable for the rest of his life. All we need is information. Where she went, how long ago, which direction. Simple questions with money-making answers. Tobias scratched his beard thoughtfully, acting the part of a man weighing greed against what's right. Well now, I hate to be unhelpful, but like I said, I ain't seen hide nor hair of any woman. Been working on my personal affairs most of the evening. He waved vaguely toward the goodbye letter on the table. Morrison moved back into the main room, his frustration clear. Colonel, we're wasting time. Every minute we spend here, she gets further away. And with that leg wound, she can't have gone far on foot. Leg wound. Tobias put that information away, even as he kept his confused look. They knew she was hurt, which meant they'd seen her recently enough to know how bad her injuries were. This wasn't a cold trail they were following. It was fresh, immediate, and urgent. Patience, Sergeant Whitfield said, never taking his eyes off Tobias. Sometimes the most valuable information comes from the most unexpected sources. He pulled a leather pouch from his coat, heavy with the clear weight of gold coins. Are you absolutely certain you haven't seen this woman? Perhaps something you might have overlooked in the emotional state you seem to be in. The bribe was clever and obvious, but it also showed something important about Whitfield's desperation. Men who were confident in their hunt didn't need to buy information from old hermits. They were worried, possibly even scared, that they might lose her trail completely. Tobias let his eyes linger on the money pouch with a show of longing. That's a lot of money. More than I've seen in years. He paused, as if fighting with his conscience. But honestly, mister, I just ain't seen her, though I gotta say, if I had, and if she was as dangerous as you claim, I'd probably have told you right off. Below them, separated by only inches of wooden planks, Celeste lay hidden in complete silence. But Tobias could feel her presence, like a physical weight, could sense her listening to every word, understanding that her life depended on his ability to convince these men that she'd never been here. What none of them could know was that 20 feet away, Celeste's blood was still soaking into the wooden floor where she'd collapsed, making a stain that would be clear to anyone who knew what to look for. And Colonel Whitfield was starting to look very carefully indeed. If you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about justice in the Old West. Whitfield's eyes began to systematically sweep the cabin floor, moving with the careful precision of a man trained to spot details others missed. Tobias felt his heart beating hard against his ribs as he realized what the colonel was doing, looking for signs of recent living tracks, disturbances in the dust that covered most surfaces. The blood stain from Celeste's leg wound was near the chair where he'd first helped her sit, dark against the old wood and growing more obvious by the second. In the lamplight, it would be clearly seen for what it was: fresh blood, recent injury, proof that someone wounded had been here within the last hour. You know, Whitfield said casually, still looking at the floor. It's interesting how a man can live alone for years and still maintain certain habits of hospitality. His gaze fixed on the chair, the only piece of furniture in the cabin that wasn't covered in dust. The one clean spot in an otherwise messy room. Tobias felt the familiar cold calculations settling over him, the mental state that had kept him alive through a dozen impossible situations. Time was running out for being subtle. In moments, Whitfield would either spot the bloodstain or notice something else that would give Celeste away. The act was crumbling, and soon there would be only two choices: kill or be killed. Don't get many chances to practice hospitality, Tobias said, moving slightly to put himself between Whitfield and the bloodstain. When a man does get visitors, he tries to remember his manners. Morrison was getting impatient, walking near the door like a trapped animal. Colonel, we're losing daylight. Even with a full moon, tracking gets harder once the temperature drops. Her trail could go cold. But the third man, who'd been quiet until now, suddenly spoke up. Sir, there's something you should see. He was kneeling near the cabin's entrance, looking at the wooden doorframe with intense focus. Fresh scratches in the doorframe. Low down, like someone was dragging their feet. Tobias's blood turned to ice. Celeste's wounded leg had indeed scraped against the doorframe when he'd helped her inside. It was exactly the kind of detail a tracker would notice, the kind of evidence that couldn't be explained away or ignored. Whitfield's head snapped toward the door, his hungry smile widening. Excellent work, Corporal Hayes. Fresh scratches, you say? Made by someone favoring an injured leg, perhaps. The trap was closing fast. Tobias could feel the weight of his hidden guns against his hips, could quickly figure out the angles and timing needed to draw and fire before any of these men could react. But for targets in a small space, with an innocent woman hiding below her, chances were terrible, and the risk to Celeste was huge. Now that you mention it, Whitfield continued, moving closer to look at the scratches himself. There are quite a few interesting details in this little cabin. A clean chair in a dusty room, fresh ink on a goodbye letter, door scratches that couldn't be more than an hour old. His eyes locked onto Tobias with strong focus. Tell me, friend, what exactly were you writing about that had you so emotional this evening? The question was a trap, cleverly set. If Tobias claimed the letter was about loneliness and despair, it would explain the tears but raise questions about his mental state. If he tried to play it down, Whitfield would know he was lying. Either way, the colonel was building a case that something important had happened in this cabin tonight. Like I said, just old thoughts, Tobias replied, but he could hear how weak it sounded. A man gets to thinking about his mistakes when he's alone too long. Mistakes, Whitfield repeated thoughtfully. What kind of mistakes does a hermit make? Seems to me, living alone out here, a man's mistakes would be pretty limited. Unless, of course, he wasn't always a hermit. Morrison stopped pacing and turned toward them, his hand unconsciously moving toward his weapon. The scratches on his face seemed to hurt in the lamplight, and his eyes held the kind of personal hatred that made smart men do foolish things. Colonel, Morrison said, his voice tight with barely held back anger. I'm telling you, she was here. I can feel it. This old man is lying through his teeth. The accusation hung in the air like gunsmoke, direct and dangerous. Tobias felt the last bits of his lie breaking one by one. These men weren't going to be fooled much longer, and when the truth finally came out, the violence would be quick and brutal. But what worried him most wasn't the threat to himself. It was the realization that Morrison's personal hatred ran so deep that he might not care about taking Celeste alive. Some kinds of family fights ended only in blood, and the scratches on Morrison's face suggested this was exactly that kind of situation. Whitfield raised his hand slightly, a gesture that immediately made everyone quiet. In the sudden silence, they could all hear it, the faint sound of breathing that wasn't quite right, coming from somewhere it shouldn't be. The sound of labored breathing from beneath the floorboards might as well have been a gunshot for the way it broke the tension. In the room, all four men froze, heads tilted slightly as they figured out what they'd just heard. It was clearly human, clearly close, and clearly coming from below their feet. Whitfield's hand moved to his sword with smooth precision. Well now, that's interesting. His voice carried the satisfied tone of a hunter who'd finally trapped his prey. Corporal Hayes, would you be so kind as to examine the floor more carefully? I believe we may have missed something important. Tobias felt the last of his options disappearing, like morning mist. The act was over, and what came next would be counted in heartbeats and gunshots. His hands hung loose at his sides, fingers already getting ready for the fastest draw of his life. For men, close quarters, an innocent woman trapped below, was the kind of impossible situation that had made the Phantom of Pine Ridge a legend. Hayes moved toward the area where the breathing had come from, his eyes looking at the floorboards with professional focus. It would take him maybe 10 seconds to find the hidden trapdoor, and then Celeste would be pulled out like an animal from its den. You know, Tobias said casually, his voice changing completely. I've been thinking about what you said earlier, Colonel, about mistakes and such. Something in his tone made Whitfield's eyes narrow. The Colonel was experienced enough to know when prey became the hunter, when the situation changed in ways that could be deadly to those who were too sure of themselves. My biggest mistake, Tobias continued, was thinking I could retire from who I really am. Thinking that burying my guns would bury the man who used them. He straightened slowly, letting his shoulders square and his back find its natural, confident posture. But some things don't stay buried, no matter how deep you dig the hole. Morrison was the first to understand what was happening. His hand quickly went for his gun, even as recognition hit his eyes. Sweet Jesus, he breathed. You're him. You're actually him. Hayes had found the trapdoor and was working his fingers under its edge when Tobias moved. The Phantom of Pine Ridge came out of 2 years of quietness, like lightning from a clear sky. Both Colts clearing leather with a speed that was too fast for normal human eyes. His first shot hit Hayes in the center of his chest before the man could even realize the danger, sending him falling backward away from the trapdoor. Morrison's gun was halfway out of its holster when Tobias's second shot spun him around and dropped him to his knees. The sergeant's weapon clattered across the floor as he clutched at his shoulder, his face showing shock and pain. Whitfield had managed to draw his saber, but found himself looking down the barrel of a Colt .45 held in a steady hand. The fourth man, frozen by the sudden burst of violence, stood with his weapon still in its holster and his hands raised in surrender. Colonel Marcus Whitfield, Tobias said, his voice carrying the cold authority of a man who'd killed 12 men in a single day and walked away without a scratch. I know who you are now. I know what you do to women like Celeste, and I know why. She came looking for the Phantom. Whitfield's face had gone pale, but his voice stayed steady. You're making a mistake, Crane. That woman is a murderer. She killed 3 of my men and stole military secrets worth more than your life. Funny thing about lies, Colonel Tobias replied, never moving his aim. They tend to grow when a man's desperate. First she was dangerous, then she was valuable, then she was unwell, and now she's a murderer and a spy. Makes a person wonder what the truth actually is. Below them, the trapdoor creaked open, and Celeste came out like a ghost rising from the grave. Her face was pale from losing blood, but her green eyes burned with a fierce determination that had carried her across dangerous land to find the one man who could help her. Hello, Marcus, she said quietly. Miss me? The colonel's calm finally broke. Celestia Morrison Whitfield, he said, and the name carried the weight of ownership, of legal possession. My dear wife, you've led us quite a chase. And suddenly, everything made terrible sense. The truth hit Tobias hard, like a punch. Celeste Morrison Whitfield. She was married to the Colonel, trapped in a legal cage that gave him the right to hunt her down like property. In the eyes of the law, everything Whitfield had done was perfectly right. A husband, chasing his runaway wife, bringing her home, where she belonged. Let me guess, Tobias said, keeping his gun pointed at Whitfield while his mind raced through what this meant. She found out something she wasn't supposed to know, something worth killing for. Celeste moved closer, her wounded leg making her movements careful but determined. 3 women. Tobias, 3 wives of Marcus's business partners, who asked too many questions about their husbands' government contracts. They all had accidents within 6 months of each other. Whitfield's laugh was bitter and confident. The crazy ideas of an unstable woman. That's what the medical reports will say when we get her back to the asylum where she belongs. The asylum. Another legal trap. Another way to silence an inconvenient woman forever. Once declared mentally ill, Celeste would disappear into a place where her word would never be believed, where she could be given medicine until she did what they wanted, or simply forgotten completely. The contracts were for moving supplies to Indian reservations. Celeste continued, her voice growing stronger despite her body's weakness. But the supplies never arrived. Blankets, medicine, food, all sold to the highest bidder, while people starved. When the wives started asking questions about their husband's sudden wealth, accidents, Morrison gasped from the floor, his shoulder wound making his voice tight with pain. Sarah fell down the stairs. Maria drowned in her own bathtub. Elizabeth took too much medicine for her headaches. His words carried the weight of admitting guilt, of a man who'd been part of something that had finally sickened even him. Tobias felt the familiar cold anger building in his chest. The same fury that had driven him to hunt down the men who'd killed innocent families at Broken Creek. Some evils were so pure, so carefully planned, that they needed the kind of justice that couldn't be found in courtrooms. You see the problem I'm facing here, Colonel, Tobias said, his voice carrying the deadly calm that had once made enemies give up without firing a shot. According to the law, you're a husband collecting your wife. But according to everything that matters, you're a murderer who needs to be stopped. Whitfield's eyes darted toward the door, quickly calculating distances and angles. Even if her wild stories were true, there's no proof, no evidence that would stand up in any court. And you, Phantom, are a wanted man yourself. How many people did you kill at Broken Creek? 15, 20, 12. Tobias replied without emotion. 12 men who were selling weapons to Apache raiders in exchange for kidnapped children. 12 men who deserved every bullet they got. The standoff stretched tight, like a wire about to snap. Whitfield still held his saber, but knew he was too far away to use it well. The remaining soldier kept his hands raised, smart enough to stay out of a fight between legends. Morrison was struggling to stay awake, blood soaking between his fingers. Walk away, Crane, Whitfield said finally. Take the woman if you want her. I'll report that we lost the trail, that she probably died of her injuries in the wilderness. Everyone wins. Tobias almost smiled at the desperation hidden behind the Colonel's calm tone. Except for the next woman who asked too many questions, and the one after that. Celeste moved to stand beside him, her presence both a strength and a terrible weakness. He'll never stop, Tobias. As long as he's alive, he'll keep killing anyone who threatens his business. More wives, more questions, more accidents. The truth of it settled into the cabin, like smoke from a funeral pyre. This wasn't just about saving one woman. It was about stopping a dozen future murders. About stopping a machine of bad things and death that fed on the quiet of the scared and the obedience of the law. Whitfield must have seen the decision forming in Tobias's eyes, because he suddenly lunged forward with his saber, desperation overriding good sense. But the Phantom of Pine Ridge had been waiting for exactly that moment, and his Colt spoke with final authority. The gunshot echoed through the cabin and out into the Colorado night, carrying with it the end of Colonel Marcus Whitfield and everything he stood for. Justice had been served by a man who'd promised never to kill again, but who'd learned that some promises were meant to be broken. As the echoes faded, Tobias looked at Celeste and saw something he hadn't seen in 2 years. Hope for a future worth living. Maybe he wouldn't need that goodbye letter after all. If you enjoyed this story of justice in the Old West, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more tales of courage and doing what's right from America's frontier. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with a twist so powerful you won't forget it anytime soon. Click on the video.